Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Reporter's Notebook. I have Emily with me here in the studio. Emily, I love how the weather is getting cooler.
Me too. Oh, wait.
Cheers.
Pumpkin spice cold brew from Starbucks. I had to get it. The weather is now under 80 degrees, so it's officially fall.
Yeah.
In my mind, at least.
I agree with you. I think once the weather hits that kind of like cool mark or whatever, where you feel that like slight breeze,
oh my gosh,
that's when it's fall. And I'm already in the fall mood. I'm already ready to get cozy and drink pumpkin spice lattes and all that good stuff. Although I'm not a fan of pumpkin spice lattes, I do like the smell of pumpkin pies and all.
See, I'm more of like a smell type person too. Like I like the smell of pumpkin and fall stuff more than I think I like the taste of them. But like I'll take it. So.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with you. Now you are here with me in the studio on this edition of Reporter's Notebook because we recorded our podcast with the politics, and we had a very interesting guest. I really liked our guest for this week. Yeah. Emily, why don't you go ahead and tell our viewers who we talked to and what we talked about?
Definitely. So our special guest for this week on our podcast was Dr. Michael O'Hanlon, and he is a senior fellow with the Brookings Institute. Thank you, Victoria. He's a senior fellow with the Brookings Institute, and he specializes in foreign defense and foreign policy issues. So we brought him on to really take a deep dive into the 20-year war in Afghanistan. How did we get there? How did we get to 9/11? How did we get to the killing of Osama bin Laden? And how did we now get to where we are now with all of our U.S. troops removed, withdrawn from Afghanistan? What happens next for the Afghan people? What happens next for American allies in this situation? So we really took a deep dive into the 20-long-year war in Afghanistan.
Right. And then one of the things that we kind of broke down was who is the Taliban? Who is Al-Qaeda? All these different ISIS, all these different factions, because I mean, to be honest, and I don't know, I'm not saying that I'm embarrassed about not knowing who these different factions are. I'm just saying that these different factions are something that we should be aware of, especially if we're going to start talking about who's actually ruling the country and defining terrorism, because that's really what the war in Afghanistan was about, was the war on terror. And so it was kind of just like, okay, so who, like defining who the enemy is, besides just, this concept of terror, defining who's running these terrorist organizations, what it means, and who our enemy is at this point, now that we've left Afghanistan, now that the Taliban is ruling Afghanistan, and how the United States might interact with that government, and some United States officials. I know Congressman Murphy, when I was talking to him last week, he called the Taliban a terrorist organization. So it's stuff like that we were trying to explore in this podcast with someone who was in Afghanistan, with someone who understands directly the footprint of what these terrorist organizations, what their footprint looks like in Afghanistan. Emily, I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to talk about in terms of what the future of Afghanistan could look like.
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting because, and our special guest mentions this, the Taliban has really they're really trying to make a point that, we've kind of moved on from our old ways, our old way of law and ruling, and they're almost trying to say, in a way, that they're more progressive as an organization now than they were when they were ruling back, 20 plus years ago. So it's interesting to hear them kind of say that, but, in the back of our minds, in the back of, other countries' minds and other foreign countries' minds, we're like, is it really though? Is that really what's going to happen? Because we kind of know that that's not the truth, and that's not necessarily what they're going to be projecting in the future within their country. It's not going to be this glorious new administration, new government that's going to be taking over and making life so much better for these people. We know in reality that it's not going to look like that. So
I think it's going to be something interesting to explore, especially now that the United States has withdrawn troops, but there, I believe, is still a few Americans in Afghanistan.
We do have some American allies still there.
Exactly. So it's just, the things that we talked about in this podcast was really what's going to happen next. We didn't really talk much about how we got here, because I believe that was more in our previous podcast episode. We talked with Dr. Francia about how America ended up in Afghanistan in the first place. We talked about 9/11. Now we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So we talked about how we ended up there, why we sent troops over there, why we stayed after our mission, which was to take out Osama bin Laden. Once that was over, why did we stay? So we kind of talked about that in our last podcast. This podcast was talking about someone whose research is in foreign policy and talks about what these different groups are now in Afghanistan and what the United States' role will be in the Middle East, and then also talked about our adversaries, Russia and China, and what that means for what our withdrawal of troops and stuff like that, what that means for Russia and China. And he had I didn't expect, I'm not going to say what his answer was, but I didn't expect his answer. That's not what I expected from his answer. Basically, it was what he told us about what he thinks about Russia and China. And I was like, oh, interesting. So this is why we have guests on, so that we can, get a full picture and have our, not beliefs, but our assumptions challenged and changed, and kind of given a broader picture of what an answer that I thought was going to be given just completely turned upside down. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. So thank you, Emily.
Yeah.
For joining me on this edition of Reporter's Notebook. Everyone, of course, you can tune into Reporter's Notebook on Apple, Spotify, at WNCT.com. We have a Zoom element to this one.
Yes.
So if you want to check out the Zoom video, you can go to WNCT.com. You click the Features tab, and then you click Podcast Network, and then you'll see the latest episode that our guest joined us on, that Emily and I uploaded today, Tuesday. But of course, you can always catch up on all the episodes, previous episodes. I think we're at number 48. 48. Wow.
48 today, girl.
48 episodes. So if you have a road trip coming up, then just download all the episodes. Exactly. And of course,
and next week is our anniversary, our 1-year anniversary officially. So we're super excited, and we're going to have maybe a little something special planned for that. We're not entirely sure yet, but stay tuned for our 1-year anniversary of What the Politics. We're really excited.
I'm super excited about that as well. Well, thank you, Emily, for joining me on this edition of Reporter's Notebook. And to everyone, I hope everyone has a great rest of your week.